all hear me okay? All right. Thank you so much for coming. And wasn't that just a beautiful Qigong meditation from Ming Tong? I just want to start out by giving a big round of applause for Cecily and Soren and Michelle and everyone who's worked so hard to throw such a tremendous event. It's an honor to be here with you all today. I am here because my good friend and colleague, Dr. Rick Doblin, fell ill and was unable to make it, so we're sending him all of our love today. And I want to leave you, after this 3-day experience that you've been here for, with hope for what's coming in the future of the way we address mental illness and the growing burden of mental illness in the world. So I think the first thing that I always like to talk about is, why are we talking about this topic? And the reason why we're talking about it is because mental illness has never been something that we were able to use the C word for. And by C, I mean cure. And for all of us who have trained in Western medicine, whether you're a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a clinician in any other capacity, we've been taught to not use the cure word with mental illness. This is very similar to the way that we looked at treating infection prior to the invention of antibiotics by Alexander Fleming in 1928, when infection was a leading cause of death in America and the world. And then antibiotics came around, and all of a sudden, bam, we could cure the leading cause of death and disability in the world. And we're around the corner from that now in mental illness. And so I want to leave you with this question to think about when you leave, which is, what if it were possible to cut rates of mental illness in half in 10 years by actually curing it at the source, rather than just treating the symptoms, which is our current Western paradigm? And to understand where we're at, we have to understand how we got here. And in the Western world, in the Western treatment of mental illness, particularly trauma and PTSD, these used to be called shell shock. And shell shock was actually the main reason why the National Institutes of Mental Health, the largest funder of mental health research in the United States, was created in 1949. And since 1949, we only have 2 FDA-cleared medications for PTSD. They're sertraline, Zoloft, and paroxetine Paxil. And they have, while some effectiveness, they actually leave over 70% of people who have been treated with the full standard of care still symptomatic and ill for life. And that's a really sad number. And we really need to be doing better. And of course, they also have some unwanted side effects, even though they are useful for certain things. And we haven't had any new FDA-approved treatments yet. MDMA-assisted therapy is on the FDA's desk now, but we haven't had anything that has actually worked better than these medications. And so this led us to wonder, when we were working in the lab at the University of Pittsburgh, and with a lot of other collaborators in the space, is it possible that the symptom management-based approach is off target? And this ended up, this manuscript ended up coming out, I believe it was about 2 years ago, as a University College of London umbrella study looking at over 100,000 people around the world from all different studies that have ever looked at depression. And what most of us were taught, including us as doctors, was that depression is caused by neurotransmitter imbalances in the brain. And in fact, that is not actually the case. And when we actually look at the way that mental illness, like depression, which is one of the most common mental illnesses, is related to what's happened in our lives, whether it be a genetic neurotransmitter imbalance, or whether it is like something we're born with that we can't change, or whether it's something else, it turns out it's actually something else. And what is that thing? It's unresolved trauma. And unresolved trauma, unprocessed trauma, correlates more strongly with untreated mental illness than any other thing, and particularly depression. And what solves it better, that's natural, than anything else, than any antidepressant? It's exercise. Surprise, surprise. But what's really interesting is this idea that trauma is the source of depression and many other mental illnesses, and probably many physical illnesses, is actually very old. And it's an idea that comes from indigenous cultures that have been around for thousands of years. Eastern medicine practitioners and tribal cultures from South America and Africa all approach illness differently than we do. They all look at it from the perspective of what happened to us that has not been resolved or healed. And so this starts to bring up a lot more questions, right? What is trauma and what is healing? And, you know, if we're amidst a complete paradigm shift in the way we think about mental health and the practice of medicine, then we need to adapt our language. Language is dynamic, it grows over time. And we need updated language to describe these terms, because the way we think about trauma and healing in the past does not necessarily apply anymore. And so I offer you an updated description of the word trauma based on what we now know from neuroscience and psychiatry, which is that traumatic experiences are actually intense, so high-density experiences that are meaningful to us and challenging over time, it could be one or many, where we perceive ourselves to be threatened in that experience, and for which we did not have adequate preparation or support after. And what this does is it draws a connection to the mind-body being intimately connected, not separate. Another fallacy of modern science that we need to start to move past. And the reason why we know this is because when people have traumatic experiences that are unresolved, what happens? We develop a more negative reference psychologically to ourselves and the world around us. The world feels more unsafe and we feel like victims to it. And that impacts the way our nervous system functions. It actually decreases our vagal tone or our parasympathetic tone, which is responsible for healing and recovery. And so this actually begs the question of, well, how then do we redefine healing? Because psychedelic medicines have taught us that healing experiences can also be intense, meaningful, challenging, and yet there's something different because we perceive ourselves to be safe within those experiences. And we do have adequate preparation and adequate support after the experience. And this transforms the landscape of the emotional nervous system and the nervous system as a whole by increasing parasympathetic or vagal tone, which is the nervous system responsible for healing. So these two experiences, healing and trauma, are actually much more similar than we thought. And it seems like the key to one being a trauma versus one being a healing experience is actually the safety of that experience. And so this started in our research to bring up the questions of, well, what if profoundly safe healing experiences can actually start to reverse the impact of trauma on our bodies and the way that our bodies store that trauma memory? And so starting in 2012, this led me to start to research psychedelic-assisted therapy, because MDMA therapy around that time, and then of course since that time, has been the most successful treatment that we have had for any mental illness. And it starts to remind us that, again, we have to go back to the language. What does psychedelic really mean? Because it's not just drugs. Psyche means mind, delos means to show or to reveal. And so psychedelic is a state of being. It's a state of being where more of our consciousness, more of ourselves is revealed to us in that state. And we can access that state through any technique that expands awareness: meditation, mindfulness, breathwork, yoga, running in a flow state, soothing touch, soothing music. There are so many ways to get there. And the psychedelic experience is a state of consciousness. And if any of you think you have never had a psychedelic experience before, I would argue that you might be mistaken, because you've all had dreams. We've all had dreams. And when we dream, we are entering into a psychedelic state. That is the most natural, uniform psychedelic state that's universally accessible to all of us. And these states require no drugs. So this is really important to understand. And one thing that's really interesting is when you look at the differences between these two particular psychedelic molecules, things like MDMA and psilocybin. Psilocybin comes from the mushroom, and MDMA comes from a long-derived chemical synthetic process of sassafras, but far distant from the original plant. And I want to draw your attention to the fact that these are actually very similar reports of what people experience, despite the fact that these molecules are completely different. People are experiencing almost the same thing. With just 1 to 3 doses of medicine in the clinical trials, over 50% of people are no longer meeting diagnostic criteria for their mental illness coming in. And what's even more interesting is that when you ask people how they feel, what was this like, they say, I felt safer than I ever remember feeling as an adult. I felt safe in my own body. They have an improved connection to self and others. These experiences are rated almost uniformly as What are the most meaningful experiences of their entire lives? And it just takes 1 to 3 doses. How is that possible? So this became the focus of my research, was to try to figure out how these things work and how 2 completely different molecular structures of compound can induce such similar experiences of healing for people. And what is the link? And safety really stood out to me. And it's important to note, for those who are unfamiliar with this space, that psychedelic medicines should not be underestimated. They are literally showing greater promise to treat mental illness and to potentially cure mental illness, meaning treat for the long term, than any other tool we have ever had in the history of psychiatry. And many indigenous cultures have been using these for thousands of years. So this is not new, but it's new to us in the Western world, and it's new to us in the Western paradigm of how we address mental illness. And so I had the great pleasure of meeting Rick Doblin in person for the first time in 2016 in New York City. And I came to Rick and I said, Rick, I've seen the results of your trials with MDMA. These are some of the most incredible findings we have ever seen. We have to figure out how this works. And Rick is very blunt, if any of you know him, and he turns to me and he says, Dave, I don't care how MDMA works. I just want to show that it works and that it works safely, because if it works and it works safely, the FDA will sign the papers and we'll be good to go. Everybody will get access. And I said, well, Rick, that's true. But again, this is 8 years ago, so we still don't have FDA clearance. But I said, Rick, this is true, but we have an access to care problem. And he was starting to talk a lot about the issues of getting this powerful treatment out to everyone and the challenges that we were facing, because it's very expensive, and the protocol is 3 doses of MDMA with 2 therapists for 42 hours of psychotherapy over 12 weeks. So when you think about that in a lifelong course of psychotherapy, it's actually a very small amount, but condensed, it costs $10,000 to $14,000. And most people can't get access to it with the 700 or 800 total trained people in the country, myself being one of them, who knows how to do this work. And so I said, Rick, if we can figure out how MDMA is inducing these effects on the brain, then there's a chance we can start to replicate the effects without MDMA. And Rick said, this is really interesting. I'm going to get you trained. So he allowed me and 3 of my psychiatry colleagues to get trained in 2016 by Mike and Annie Mithofer, which was one of the most meaningful training experiences of my life. And it really kicked off this research into how these medicines were working. And what really stood out to me was that psychedelic medicines fall into this category of compounds we don't have good words to describe, so I'm offering new language to you might not have heard before. And one of those words that we'll use is called Neuroc Catalytic. So this is accelerating brain activity, increasing brain function, enhancing neuroplasticity, our ability to learn, providing perspective, and expanding awareness. And what's even more interesting is that when you go back into the literature and you look at all the other things that have been researched over many, many years that are not new, these are all the things that do that naturally. Breathing intentionally, just by choosing to breathe, doesn't really matter how you do it. Especially if you do it slow and deep, you can accelerate safety in the body and facilitate learning. Meditation, mindfulness, soothing touch, soothing music, movement, nutrition, choosing intentionally what you put into your body is a way to cultivate a learning environment in your body, help you feel in control and therefore safe, and sleep, which is our deepest, most essential recovery state in the body. That's where we get all of our physical, mental, and emotional recovery. And psychedelic medicines are unique because they are inherently neurocatalytic. They are mind-revealing, they're perspective-enhancing, they are molecules that are non-specific amplifiers of awareness and neuroplasticity, which was this non-specific amplifier of awareness was a term coined by Dr. Stan Grof many, many decades ago. And this includes a lot of other medicines that we might not have thought of in their families, like cannabinoids, powerful psychedelic medicines, medicines that could be used in assisted therapy that currently aren't, but are very, very powerful psychedelics. Ketamine, currently available, the only legal psychedelic that's legal in every state in almost every country worldwide, which is why we're starting to see it scale, and it's extremely safe. It's a very powerful tool. Phenethylamines, which are the family of medicines that include MDMA and mescaline. And then, of course, tryptamines like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, and ayahuasca are all within this family of what we call neurocatalytic substances. They accelerate learning in the brain. And when you direct that learning towards the default mode network, which is that part of our brain which is represented by all these blue areas, that represents what our brain is doing at rest: self-protection, self-guarding, self-identity, and this understanding of what we call in psychology ego, that these parts of the brain are active in most of us most of the time. And they're trying to protect us because that's what we've trained them to do. And these parts are all active, just doing their thing, talking to each other, and they make up this network that we call the default mode, which is like our regular state of being. And the default mode network is commonly misunderstood, so I'll break it down for you. This is like building pathways in the brain like the default mode is like skiing down the same slope the same exact way every single time. So every time you go down that run, the run gets deeper. Your grooves get deeper. It becomes easier to go down without thinking. You don't really need to worry about where you're going to go or what you're going to do because the grooves are already there. And this is called entrainment. And we entrain patterns and automate patterns in the brain. We are the fanciest AI automation machines in the world. And we're doing it all the time. Every single moment of our lives, we're retraining our brain or training our brain to do new things without even realizing it. Thinking about yourself as being worthy of love versus thinking about yourself as being unworthy of love is training your brain to continue to think about yourself that way. The brain doesn't care whether it's positive, joyful, or negative, sad. The brain just automates stuff. And Eric Kandel won the Nobel Prize for discovering this in 2000. And so when you take so the default mode network is really important though, because it regulates our survival responses and keeps us in the realm of what we know. It helps us cross the street without getting hit by a car. It helps us focus on things when we need to do certain things and take care of all the things we do at rest. But when you take a psychedelic medicine or enter a psychedelic state or via meditation or anything else, this reduces default mode network activity and connectivity, and it attenuates ego. Our sense of self-protection, self-survival kind of comes down a little bit. And it leaves us with infinite possibilities, almost like getting to the top of that same run you've skied down 1,000 times, and then 8 feet of fresh powder drops on top of you. And you know where the bottom is, but you don't know the way you used to get there. So now you have a complete open field of opportunity to choose a different path or to create a new path. And this is what we're doing with our patients when we provide them with psychedelic-assisted therapy, is we're guiding them to find a path that is actually serving them, not necessarily the path that they were taking all this time. And Eric Kandel, I have to mention because, again, his Nobel Prize-winning work for the discovery of memory was in these little friends of ours, the Aplysia sea snail, which is 300 million years old. 300 million years old. And the reason why he won the Nobel Prize is because he figured out that they learn and remember fear and safety responses almost the exact same way that we do. This is conserved for much longer than humanity. The process that we make memories around fear and safety has been conserved for over 300 million years. This is hardwired into our DNA and into our nervous system. And so when we understand what that really means, what it means is that what our moms told us growing up is true. Practice makes perfect, or mastery, because there's no such thing as perfect, but practice makes mastery. The more you do anything, the better you get at it. So be intentional. Right? Be intentional with what you do and how you think about yourself and the words that you use to describe yourself, right? This is so important because the more that you choose certain words or certain ways to think about ourselves, the better we get at doing that thing. So we should really, really, really care about where we put our human energy and how we think about ourselves. And psychedelic medicines are also interesting because in more recent research, we've seen that they enhance neuroplasticity. And they enhance neuroplasticity not just by creating new networks in the brain, they enhance neuroplasticity by increasing the number of new neurons made from neural stem cells in the hippocampus, our short-term memory center. And what happens when information comes into our short-term memory center? We fall asleep, we dream, we enter REM, and then that gets translated into long-term memory. And that becomes concreted in our brains like the cement of a foundation hardening. And so this fundamental ability of these medicines as neurocatalytic medicines or tools that enhance learning and enhance recovery, we are starting to see is actually playing out in the way that people are getting better from long lives of suffering from mental illness, and they sustain their betterness. They continue to get better over time. And this is really exciting. We've never seen anything like it. And so after all of that, we started to realize that there are two things that have to happen in this field for us to be able to move forward, which are, number one, as I mentioned earlier, we have to start to understand this mechanism so that we can replicate the effects of psychedelic medicines and how they're changing our learning capacity and improving our ability to learn without drugs. Because only so many people are going to get access to these drugs, and there are a lot of people who are not good candidates for drugs, especially psychedelic drugs. We also need to develop more objective biomarkers for predicting treatment responses and enhancing outcomes. And I'll start with number two, which is really interesting because this study is a study that was published in February of 23. It's the first study of its kind that evaluated the theory that Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who runs the Trauma and Psychedelic Department at Mount Sinai, proposed by studying Holocaust survivors. And she showed that that we've always known for probably 100 years that if you experience trauma and then you have children, and then your children have children, and your trauma hasn't been resolved, then your children and your children's children, and even your children's children's children will have an increased risk of mental illness. But nobody's known why. And so Rachel Yehuda showed for the very first time that you can actually understand why by looking at cortisol receptor genes. And she showed that if you look at the cortisol receptor system, we actually pass down epigenetic markers of trauma on cortisol receptors that change the way they function in response to stress. So that means that trauma is not just inheritable because when we're hurt, we hurt other people, but because when we're hurt, there's a memory of that hurt stored on our cortisol receptors, our stress response system, one of the main receptors of our stress response system, and probably lots of other places, but that's the easiest one to look at. And then that memory that's stored on that receptor, which causes its dysfunction, passes down over time and is inherited by our children. And so we thought, well, if trauma's like learned fear over time, then perhaps when all these people are getting better, 88% response rate to MDMA-assisted therapy in the MAPS phase 3 trials, breakthrough result, how is that possible? And how is it possible that these people get better, not just 2 months after the treatment's over, but that the number of people who are better is even higher at 1 year out? How is it possible with no additional treatment, people just do 3 doses of MDMA and 12 weeks of psychotherapy, and then 1 year out, more people are better than were right after the treatment? We've never seen that either. And so we decided, well, let's measure what's happening with their cortisol receptors. And so we worked with MAPS, and this was actually an idea that Rick and I worked together very closely on starting in 2016 when I was doing my MDMA training, where we collected epigenetic DNA samples from people who were going through the MAPS phase 3 trial. And we compared what their cortisol receptor expression patterns looked like before and after. And 2 really interesting findings came from that, which is number 1, that MDMA-assisted therapy is actually reversing and starting to the repair process on the cortisol receptor gene. So the functioning of the cortisol receptor gene that you can measure with methylation and these epigenetic markers is improving significantly with MDMA-assisted therapy, the same gene that is disrupted in PTSD. What's even more interesting that we did not expect to find is that the more better people got, the better people responded to MDMA-assisted therapy, the more cortisol receptor repair they had. So now there's a biomarker. We have a way that people can spit into a cup before they start and multiple times during their treatment and start to understand how well are you responding to this treatment? Is this working for you? Are you still experiencing cortisol receptor dysfunction due to trauma? Or are you on the path? This is working for you. This is good. And so this really sets a foundation for looking at and tracking the marking and memory of trauma and healing on our epigenetic code all the way down to our DNA. And cortisol is a safety response gene. It's critical to the stress and safety pathways in the brain. And so we thought, okay, well, if cortisol is a stress response gene, maybe there are tools we can use like soothing touch, soothing music, soothing somatic sensations that can start to naturally get this process going. And so we developed a tool out of my research at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center called Apollo that Michelle was mentioning she's wearing earlier, and I am as well, that delivers soothing vibration to the body through your sense of touch that, just like getting a hug from a loved one, stimulates the emotional cortex of the brain with safety. And when you stimulate that part of the brain with safety, which is the same part of the brain that MDMA stimulates, that you can actually start to induce feelings of safety on the body and the go. And what's really interesting is we've started now replicating comparative studies between using this touch therapy technology and MDMA with the Denver VA, which just wrapped up this quarter. It's currently in analysis, comparing the epigenetic changes induced by the profound safety states induced by MDMA to the safety states induced by Apollo over time. And now this technology is also the first technology that's being used actually in psychedelic therapy. So full circle, we are psychedelic clinicians in the MAPS trial. The patients who have finished the MAPS trial with MDMA are using it for integration. And then we have ketamine clinics using it to enhance ability to drop in and feel calm during ketamine sessions. And we also have group therapists using it with psilocybin and ketamine in British Columbia for traumatized first responders to improve their outcomes with these treatments. So technology has a real role to play in the way that we think about scaling healing. And this is just some brief data that you can look at, but this is just real-world data. We have tons of clinical trials, but real-world data showing that people with PTSD using this technology are having similar response rates to MDMA. And this is real-world data showing that using this technology is actually improving people's quality and outcomes in their psychedelic experiences. And I think regardless of where you find your safety, where you find this really important thing that we were all supposed to learn growing up, the number one neuroscience takeaway is that safety is required. It's not optional. It's required to make meaningful life changes that stick. And it's required to activate the healing process. We know it because safety, however you induce it, with breathing, with soothing touch, with music, with technology, with psychedelics, with a kind, empathetic glance from a loved one or even just somebody on the street, you are augmenting your vagal tone. You're changing the activity in your nervous system to be in a state that allows healing to happen, that allows our bodies to start to do what they know how to do, which is to activate our ability to heal ourselves. And the most important way that we can all do that right now, at any time, is just to remind ourselves that we are worthy of love. This is the single most important way that we can all feel safe within our own skin, within our own bodies, wherever we go. This is always available to us. Thank you.